Hi, if you want to take your seats because the proceedings are about to begin. Everyone, my name is Caroline and I'm going to be guiding you through today at this amazing ESI conference in Birmingham. And I think we're all super excited to be here because we know that after this, it's going to be ESL One. But we'll come to that later. So first of all, we're all here to learn about esports. Now, I recognize a few of your faces in there, and there's some of you that I don't know. And I think all of you are going to be looking forward to seeing and learning a lot more about this dynamic and really innovative industry. Now, we wouldn't be here without our partners and our sponsors, so we have to thank Intel, PwC, and the NEC for letting us use their amazing venue. So, Esports Insider, I don't know how much you know about them, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro now. So, they are a news website that cover all things business and esports, which I think will be quite beneficial to a lot of you here. But aside from that, they also host, well, things like this. So this is the first one in Birmingham, obviously, and before that, they've done ones in Fnatic, and that was all through last year as well. So if you're interested in learning more about esports as this goes on, come to these things. It's cool to meet people, and you're going to hear some very impressive experts coming up soon. Another thing about Intel, since we were talking about sponsors, there is a really cool little giveaway going on. So what I want you actually to do is I want you to tweet throughout today anything cool and creative that you can think of to do with this panel, well, all of the panels, and I want you to tweet it at Intel UK or at ESI Birmingham, and you can win yourself a really snazzy processor. So, guys, get doing that. I think it's going to be cool. And what? I need an upgrade. Oh, see, Heather wants to do it too, but I don't know if you can do it. Oh. So, feels bad, man. Right, so we've spoken about ESI, but I want to talk about ESL. So I'm sure a lot of you know what ESL does. Otherwise, well, you wouldn't really be here and be super hyped for the rest of the weekend. But ESL is essentially the largest esports organization in the entire world. We have offices everywhere. We do things from tournaments to media to influencers, crazy reach. And I think all of you know what they do, and it's amazing to be part of that, I think. And what you're going to get today from hearing from people from ESL and from all over this industry is just how fantastic it is to be involved with it now. Right. I think you've heard enough from me. I'm going to pass you on to some amazing experts, and Heather is going to be starting this panel as a moderator. So, guys, please take it away.
Thanks, Caroline. And thank you for everyone sitting down and joining the first panel. I'm Heather, I'm the marketing manager at ESL UK, quite fresh into the role, and quite fresh into the role of moderator, so this could be an interesting dynamic, but I have a lot of professionals, as Caroline mentioned, that will help us guide through what is, to me, and probably a lot of people in the room, a very, very important topic, and that is community. And as the title says, it is the lifeblood of all things gaming. So we're going to kind of explore that and what really this means to the industry about community. Before we do that, I better let people introduce themselves. As you can notice, there's quite a diverse panels of Johns and Chris's. So we've sat in order so you can figure out who's talking and find them at the end for their questions. So I'll pass over to John number one.
Thanks so much. So I'm John Winkle, so I run Epic LAN. We're a community gaming event that takes place 3 times a year, and we're often the first route for people into live events in gaming. Outside of that, we're supporting more and more other businesses, particularly from a tech support point of view, using those expertise that we've built up running our own events and passing those on to other people.
Cool. I am John too. I run a company called National Student Esports, which is a newly formed organisation in partnership with BUCS, who are the governing body for university sport. We don't look to recognise esports as a sport within university, but what we do look to do is to use BUCS sporting infrastructure that they've formed over 100 years to help accelerate the development of esports within universities. And before that, I worked at Multiplay, helping run the Insomnia Gaming Festival, which was based over at the NEC, and then Game, working on the development of the Belong strategy.
Hi, everyone. Ooh. Okay. Yes, indeed. I'm Chris Murphy. I'm an associate producer at Square Enix Collective, which is the indie wing of Square Enix, which is a game publishing house. We currently working on titles like Battalion 1944, which is focusing fairly heavily on the competitive side of the first-person shooter genre. Prior to that, I worked for about 7 years in community management across companies like Electronic Arts, Ubisoft, with titles along the lines of the free-to-play offerings for Battlefield, Ghost Recon, Dirty Bomb, and then Nosgoth here at Square Enix. And really looking to push kind of esports and competitive gaming as a very strong retention tool within kind of those free-to-play environments and live environments from now on. Yeah, that's basically it.
All right. I'm Doreen Vanderheyden, otherwise known as Shiver. I am an esports panel host, personality, interviewer, commentator for all things Dota 2. I am happy to call myself one of the top on-air talent in Dota 2, and I've been part of most major events in Dota 2. So all my questions, all the answers rather that I'm going to give, will probably have some reference to Dota 2 or the Dota 2 community, because that is a very big game and obviously a big Dota 2 community-driven game as well.
Okay, I'm Chris Archambault. The internet knows me as Chris Archie. I come from being an influencer. 5 years I was doing that full time, eventually being hired on by Jagex. Jagex is located in Cambridge. We have the games RuneScape and Old School RuneScape, an MMO that's lasted 17 plus years now, so quite a while. We've now kind of managed to dip our toes into the water as far as esports goes, which I'm looking after, as well as our influencers and all things competitive gaming in general.
So obviously there's a lot of experience on this panel today, and I want to explore kind of where everyone's first kind of experience of seeing where true involvement of community really made you think, wow, that's the community's involvement is key to the success here. Obviously we all come from community in some shape and form, and I'm sure we'll touch upon that, but it's probably not it might be your experience of when you first got involved in gaming or esports, but where was that key iconic moment of community involvement for you?
I mean, as far as Dota 2 goes, I'm sure everybody here has heard about the prize pools that Dota 2 has, and I think that is one of the biggest examples of a community coming together and making something that is already good a ton better. We had a $23 million prize pool last international, and 21 of that was community funded, which is crazy. And it's even more crazy to think that this year will probably be more than $23 million, which is mad. So as far as a community coming together, that is a major example for it.
I suppose for me, the first example that really jumped out at me and got me interested in getting into the games industry and more focusing on esports was with the Battlefield franchise and seeing the community come together and create really cool mods and maps for that game to make it a more competitive title, so that what initially was a very broad kind of just fun multiplayer shooter then kind of funneled into much more of a high-level competitive game that really captured and engaged the really hardcore fans and kept them playing for years after the game stopped receiving updates and support. And that was the first time I realized that working with the community and working with esports is an absolutely fantastic way to kind of generate ongoing fan interaction and keep people playing your games. And I wanted to really push that then within all of the companies that I've worked for since.
Yeah, sure. So with Old School RuneScape in specific, many people might not know that we actually pull pretty much everything we put into the game to the community. It's very unique. I don't think it's done in any other game that I know of, at least. But essentially, for us to push an update live, it will typically come from the Q&A or from the community. In one of our weekly Q&A live streams we do with our staff, where we sit down in front of maybe 10,000 people, they pitch their ideas, we tell them what we like of them, what we don't like. We then put it to a poll. If it passes 75%, which we might get 50,000 to 100,000 people voting, the real committed players. If it passes 75%, we put it into the game. We then evaluate dev costs and resource, etc. So it's an entire sense of community with our game. We also hire a lot from the community, like myself. I've been a player of RuneScape for over a decade, as are most of the people on our Old School RuneScape team. And our competitive game mode, being Deadman, which I might touch on later, that is a community-inspired idea that has just been thriving, and it's pretty much all community funded from that.
So I'll answer this in a slightly different way. My first experience of community in esports was about 20 years ago, because my parents were really irresponsible, and they let me play Counter-Strike at the age of 8 years old. The the games used to be set up slightly differently. So again, this is going to be a really frustrating answer for the esports guys in the room. But if you rewind 20 years, when a game was kind of being played online, a lot of the time people would purchase dedicated servers, and they would essentially run the digital football pitches themselves. And so you wouldn't just hit a button and be matched with random players. You would actually choose a destination that you wanted to go and play, a destination where you wanted to go and play. And what that meant was that people would come back to the same place over and over and over again, and they would organically build a network. So as a kind of 8, 9, 10-year-old guy on the internet, I would... Sounds really irresponsible, doesn't it? I would come back to the same... We used to call them public servers, and we'd abbreviate it to pubs, which is quite a nice word, actually, because it does give you that community feel. It's the same principle. You come back to the same place. And we organically formed a network between us. I'd see the same names every day, and after 5 days of seeing the same names and knowing that they recognized you as well, you would start saying hello, and then you would ask each other how their week was going, and then you would slowly build a relationship. I think that was the magic moment where I realized that actually the relationships that you form online are real, they're not virtual. Now, my parents didn't get that for about 5 years until I bought a headset and I started connecting to voice servers. And they started hearing me saying the same names over and over again. It was, hi, Anders, my Swedish friend, every day. And eventually they knew that Anders was my friend as well, and they realized that it was real. So it was those were the two kind of magic moments for me from a community feel perspective. Those were the moments when I realized that actually I was building real relationships.
A similar example, and no surprise it's going to be a LAN party related one from me. But back in 2001, I don't know if anybody played a game called Planetarian. Might be 1 or 2 people out there. Web-based game, completely destroyed my life around school time. But I noticed that the organisers of that game were planning a meet-up at some racecourse down in Newbury. And the creators of that game were going to be there as well. So I went along with my mother's permission to my first Insomnia event, or I8 back as it was then, and just to play this web-based game. And while we were there, we noticed people playing a little bit more seriously than us in things like Counter-Strike, Quake 3, and I kind of wondered what was going on. So booked again to attend the year after, and little known secret, I actually entered a CS tournament and got grouped very early on. But 2 years later, we then set up our own events and just continued doing that. But it was that meeting people outside, away from that online environment, and then continuing to make friendships.
We are sharing microphones, sorry. So with that's really interesting because it's like a different kind of... You've got the very basic where the community starts and kind of how far they can get involved. And I'm going to dissect that now. So what I want to take a look at is potentially where are the first signs and signals that someone feels like they are part of a community, or they've got that kind of signposting of this is where the community is in your respective field. So, if I want to be part of the RuneScape or an Epic LAN community, or, part of my university, or I'm playing a game with Square Enix, or wanting to be part of talent, where do I start to feel, where do I go to become that community? How do I start getting involved?
Sure. So our game is very influencer focused. The influencers in our game have a very strong hold in our community and the game as a whole. So typically when designing content, specifically the competitive stuff, we do tend to bring our influencers into the office. We have them through the beginning of the design process. They pitch their ideas and feedback and everything. And this isn't just their feedback. This is the feedback from their hundreds of thousands of followers. So once we get this feedback on board, we put it into the actual game. We then put it live. The influencers are then in front of their audiences talking about how great it is and how proud they are to have contributed. So for our players and our viewers alike, because our player-to-viewer ratio is absurd, a lot of them really just spend a lot of time playing the game and watching a stream at the same time. So it's typically in those Twitch communities where the old-school RuneScape communities are built at the same time. And then they come to RuneFest or Deadman events and they meet each other and everything. But I would say, it's a lot of game plus YouTube and Twitch hand in hand.
Yeah, I think that's one of the beauties of online communities. If you want to join them, you can just literally go online and you can already be a part of that. You just have to go to Twitch chat. You can spam emotes. I mean, obviously there's different types of Twitch chats. If you have a stream with 10K viewers, you can't expect to have a normal conversation with someone. But then there's that community feel of everybody spamming the same emotes, which sounds really silly, I know that, but it does give that community feel to people. As far as joining a talent community, that's a bit of a tricky question, because personally I come from the community as well. I think all talent in all games, all on-air talent comes from the community, or at some point was just a viewer, like many others. Mostly people that want to do something in esports just start doing it. You know, you can stream on Twitch. You don't have to wait for someone to invite you, like, hey, I would like you to stream on Twitch. No, you can just actually plug in your computer. And that's brilliant of it too. You don't have to have this whole studio at home. You can just literally do it from your mom's basement, which a lot of people do. But but overall, it's very open, and I think that as far as the community goes, I think that is making any esports community very unique, because it is so accessible. All the people that don't want to go to clubs, don't want to go to football or any type of pub because, you know, social environments are a little bit scary sometimes. You don't have to go to a social environment. You can just do it from your computer. You can just chat. You don't even have to chat. There are so many people just watching esports, being a part of the community without saying a word, but they are still feeling like they're a part of it, and that's beautiful.
Yeah, I suppose to your point, I grew up in the arse end of nowhere in Ireland. There was no one around me, nowhere to go. And I had a 56k connection that only just about got 14k. But I was able to jump online and kind of just access communities from all over the world. In Ireland at the time, we were very fortunate that there was basically one forum that everyone in Ireland participated in. It was kind of like Reddit is today, but just for Ireland. And that's where I came across the Quake community and kind of started talking to them about games and getting online. And so it's really important just to acknowledge that with online gaming communities and esports, you can kind of touch players that all over the world that they can be in the middle of nowhere and you're still accessing them, right? It's a really important point. And to that point then, from Square Enix point of view and how we look at our community and getting players to become invested in it, because once they do become invested in it, they are much more likely to stay around longer and become much more engaged and spend more money with us. So that's why we're driving for that. The game itself, the client portal, is extremely important for driving people towards the forums, the social channels, everywhere where there's discussion taking place around the game. We want people there. We want to be sending them there to find an environment where they feel comfortable talking about the game, learning more about it, learning more about everyone who's involved with it, and then that works for esports too, embedding streams and things like that of a high level competitive play gives something for players to aspire to. They can see how good you can get and how good I want to get, and I want to be that guy on the stage eventually. And so they just fixate and keep playing for a long amount of time. And they eventually become the evangelists for the game as well. So they start really promoting it and saying, hey guys, come on, play this with me. It's really fun, which is what we love to see. We want people to spread the word about our fun games. And so that's in terms of onboarding people into the community through the client, through the social channels, is kind of where we are right now. 10 years ago, it would have been online forums and things like that.
So this is a hard one for me to answer from a student perspective, because I'm actually still kind of learning the university space. We've got much more capable people than me that have working in the team that have their kind of roots in the university community. But I think something that I've always experienced as a kind of a magical moment that's a progression from realizing that there is a community there to actually really feeling like part of that is actually the moment when you come offline. So when your first kind of physical experience of esports and actually seeing people in person and realizing that actually until you meet the people that you're talking to, or until you see people that have the same enthusiasm for esports as you do, everything kind of feels like it's in the shadows. You still feel like it's outside the mainstream. You maybe feel like you're the only person that knows about this. And when you get to a live event, you walk in and you see 10,000 people sitting there. It's it's almost a culture shock, because you realize that this is something that's emotionally relevant to other people, not just yourself. The reason I love the university space is because universities are a natural a natural kind of basis for that physical interaction to happen on a much smaller scale and therefore a lot more accessible. And it was one of the things that kind of inspired the Belong strategy at Game that we worked on, was the idea of bringing that down to a physical location, but making that more accessible, that you didn't have to travel from all the way across the country to a single location. It was regionalised. Because that experience is so amazing. And when you first meet somebody that you've known online for 10 years, I got another great example, like a guy I met, again, parents irresponsible, guy I met online when I was 12, we were sort of best friends until we were about 20. He lived in Sweden. We never met. But eventually he got a job at Helly Hansen in Oxford, and we moved in together. And the first few weeks, yeah.
Where's this going?
No,
do you need to cut this off?
The first few weeks were strange because you know you know each other really well. It's the same. Okay, great example. LAN events, probably a better example.
Don't drag me into this.
You meet your teammates for the first time. You've been practicing online with them 4 hours a day for the last 8 weeks. And then you meet them for the first time at the event, and you still feel like strangers. It still feels like you're meeting a stranger for about 6 hours. And then suddenly everything flips, and it's like you've known each other for 8 weeks, and it's that moment that's kind of transition.
That's most of my answer, to be honest. We are that evolution from teams playing together online. They then eventually decide we might be good enough or not to go and meet up in a live event, turn up to the tournament, probably go off to Nando's, delay the tournament while waiting for them to come back, and then just continue gaming together until they break up after a loss and then form a new team for the next event. But yeah, it's the starting point for us is certainly that online and getting those players to leave the bedroom and come and meet up in real life.
I'll probably start with you, John, to answer this one. Community is really key. Without community, I think you guys might agree we wouldn't be here today. If you think if you took community out of the equation, where would esports be? Where would the players come from? Where would we go to sit? So if we feel like they have quite a heavy involvement in our every day-to-day jobs, and I was kind of wondering what the community has done with their feedback that you may have obtained and searched for, or sometimes not even asked for and been given, on your decision makings at our top level business decision there. So, was there anything that the community said and you said, we really need to listen to these guys and make these changes?
For us, we're about 90% funded by ticket income, so that we don't have massive sponsorship or commercials. So without that community, our events literally don't exist. So everything down to where the event is physically in the country, the titles as an example. Back at our previous venue, and I think when John actually turned up to one of our events many, many years ago, we were very heavily reliant on COD 4. And in fact, until recently, we've only just beaten our sort of team record for that. And over the space of 2 events, the entire COD 4 community decided we're not playing this anymore. We're going off to other titles. And we were like, oh, crap, what do we do now? And we maybe ran 2 titles at the time. I think TF2 was the other one. That didn't really help. So we've had to listen to the community. We've had to follow the direction of the community. We've had to adapt the titles. We made changes to our lineup this year to introduce something new. But yeah, if we don't listen to those guys, either by going and asking them, inviting feedback, or going to wherever those communities talk between events, then there's nothing left for us, really.
I think something that's really important to say at this point is not only would the events not be happening, etc. Without that community feedback, esports wouldn't be here, because no publisher 15, 20 years ago would have had the balls to make any of the games in the first place. Like they didn't come from publishers saying, "Hey, we've got a great idea for a game." They came from the community picking up the tools that the publisher had put in there to allow them to actually change the game and modify the game, and then using that as a basis for creating a game. Counter-Strike was a high lethality game that was quite slow-paced by the standards in kind of late 90s, and no publisher would have made it. Dota 2 or Dota and the original mods that led to the creation of Dota, no publisher would have thought of doing that. It was nonsense. Try explaining a MOBA game to somebody that has it's so complicated. And then you've got the same with, most recently, I guess, with Battle Royale games. 25 minutes invested only to get headshot by a sniper on the other side of the map, and all that time is gone. No publisher would have had the guts to do that themselves on a AAA title. So community feedback is essential because it's actually allowed us to evolve those games, and it will continue to allow us to evolve those games. From our perspective at NEC, it's also incredibly important because every university community is completely different. Both in the kind of the way that the university is set up to recognise and support them, but also in the way that they're formed, the way that their relationships with other elements of the university. And so a completely tailored approach is essential, otherwise you end up getting nowhere. And I think that's true of pretty much every regionalised community base.
Yeah, I'd just like to double down on what you said. I mean, as a publisher, I can absolutely confirm that we would not have picked up any of those titles for a AAA game right out of the gate. The risk is just way too high. What I will say is it's our job to try and make fun games, and that goes for multiplayer and single-player games alike. Our focus is making fun games that as many people around the world can enjoy as possible. And then once we've done that, then we want to try and expand. And if the community is looking to go in a competitive direction, then that's something that we'll look to try and support. It very much does depend on seeing that kind of call for that kind of direction from the community, so that we can then look at potentially integrating tools within the game, such as spectator cameras and the ability to set up private matches and things like that, so that they can go about creating kind of small-scale competitive events themselves. And once we see that's happening, then that's a really good indicator that there's some kind of potential for a game to have a competitive life. And once we see that, then we can really start to invest more money into providing the support they require, and then potentially picking the ball up and running with it, giving them direct funding for events and tournaments and things like that, and then maybe running them ourselves.
It seems like a very difficult balance to have, because sure, you have a community on one side that is all-powerful. Sure, without community we wouldn't be here. Everybody comes from the community. The games come from there. But at the same time, if you're a developer or if you want to create something, you can't just blatantly copy everything that the community says, because then your game would probably not be very good. So it seems it's very tricky to balance that. Referencing to Dota 2, an example comes, there's all these balance patches that happen every once in a while to make sure that the game stays interesting, that nothing's overpowered. And everybody has their own ideas. If I'm really bad at one hero, I'm like, well, that hero, that's just a bad hero. It's not me, it's the hero. So the hero needs to be buffed. And if everybody says that, at some point a developer might think, you know what, maybe this hero is bad, let's buff it. And then all of a sudden you've got this hero that is out of control because I couldn't play the game. That is something that you got to really be very careful to balance it according to what the community thinks. As far as talent goes, at one event, one person wasn't invited, and he had a big fan base, and everybody was like, why is this person not invited? And in the end, they invited him still to be talent at that event, which was, at that point, it was the right decision to make. But the year after that, it happened again, because the community thought, you know what? Last year they answered. Last year they listened. Let's do it again. And they created these competitions to try and get everybody to an event. Well, as an organizer, that's not where you want to be, because you have to limit the power the community has. And you got to protect them for their own good. And that's a very tricky balance to walk. But it's something that needs to be there, because otherwise everything will go to hell.
Right. So I think the biggest example for us is the launch of Old School RuneScape. I'm not too sure how many people might be familiar, but essentially RuneScape, the game that's been lasting for over 17 years, some know as RuneScape 3. Some players preferred the older version, the more nostalgic version of the game, before we started to make changes to things like the combat and everything else. So they started signing this petition, which we gave to them, got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of signatures, and everybody coming forward and saying, we want the old version of the game back, please launch the two side by side. And what we gave them were options. We said that if you get this many signatures on this petition, we'll give you a small development team, maybe one developer, one QA, one artist. If you get this many signatures, etc. Anyways, they got to the top, obviously. So we launched Old School RuneScape. We actually had it on, I think, a floppy disk, which was RuneScape 2007, So we just said, here you go, here's your old nostalgic version that looks like it's from 2007, which it still does, because it's limited by things within resource engine, etc. But they love it, and it has now surpassed the other game, the more modern game, in terms of viewership, average player count, and everything. So it just goes to show the millions of players that we've ever had over all these years. They want to continue to remember their childhood, cling to that, and then kind of adjust with more modern games, take features that they like out of those games, bring them into their game that they've always come to love and grown up with. So that's the biggest example for us.
Yeah, and you do a lot of Q&As and have a lot of kind of feedback from the community actively, like on a weekly basis. And I think we all have different touch points when we get feedback. Maybe you're on Reddit and you check through, or maybe you stay away from it. Developers, you obviously have forums, and feedback's really key. Is there any kind of stand-up moments, or is there a path from a community to get involved in the industry and they end up looking back at the community's feedback and applying it into their workforce? Shiva, maybe you might know of an example to start.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of people that obviously want to do things in esports because everybody wants to work where their hobby is at. That's fortunate for me that I can do that, but unfortunately for a lot of people, there's only a limited amount of spaces available. And there's a lot of people that want to be a commentator because that is something that you can start from your basement. You can start that at home. You don't have to have a lot of experience. You can just start doing it. And people go to a forum like Reddit. It's like, hey, I commentated this game. Can you please watch the game and tell me what you think? And that person will get crushed because he probably wasn't very good. But that is how a lot of people start. I personally was just a commentator from my room because I wanted to get people to watch the game. And I decided, I might as well talk over it because otherwise it's kind of awkward sitting here and quiet. And that's how I got to commentating. And that grew. You grow with a couple of people watching you that enjoy it, and then those couple of people tell their friends, like, hey, can you watch the game with me? It's fun. It's a quiet Twitch chat, you can just watch together, and then you grow like your own community. That is one route that people can take. That is one route that a lot of people try to take. That is why all those streaming platforms are so successful, because everybody wants to create their own community and wants to feel at home to be able to do that. And I think for everything that people want to do in esports, it doesn't even, commentating sure is one thing, and all the on-camera thing is one thing, but at the same time, if you want to try and organize a tournament, you can do that. There's so many amateur teams out there that are so happy to just participate in whatever gets thrown their way, that anything that you want to do, you can probably find a way to make it happen within any esports community.
I suppose in all walks of life, or at least across game development and esports, just do it. Just do it. If you want to do something, just go out and do it. If you want to make a game, start building prototypes, start building demos, start getting feedback on them. As you say, you get in touch with people who are kind of in a similar vein, have a similar mindset, see what they think. You'll improve over time. Just do it. Ideally, if you can get paid for it, that's great, but oftentimes you'll have to do things voluntarily at first to learn and kind of get up to a certain skill level, and then just do it. That's as easy as it is.
One of the good things about the internet and getting feedback from the community is that on the internet everybody has an opinion, so they'll always have something to say, be that nice or not. You'll always get some feedback, even if it's not very positive.
Yeah, I think there's a big thing with mutual respect as far as community and developers seem to go. So when we do our weekly Q&A live streams, we gather questions from the community, and we have people that work at Jagex sitting on the sofas answering these questions which they can relate to. So when a player is complaining about something that seems like such a small little detail, like, can you remove this? I hate having to walk around it. It slows my pathing down to this obstacle. Somebody on the development couch might just be like, you know what, I actually experienced that yesterday when I was playing in my spare time. You're right, that's out of the game as of tomorrow. So that will happen very frequently with us. And most, if not all of our people that work at Jagex are on Twitter, some of which with ridiculous amounts of followers that reply to literally every single tweet, any question, no matter how small. So there is a very strong communicational tie between our players and developers.
We formed NSC through a partnership between Bucks and a sports organisation, sports consultancy group, essentially. They wouldn't like me saying that, but that's kind of what they are. And what that means is we have access to a bunch of sports professionals that are experts in their field, an amazing network, great relationships. But they're sports people, they're from the sports world. We've actually got a guy working on the project who is a PR director for IMG. And he would always ask questions about communication, tone of voice. What channels are we using? How are we doing that? And there was this really interesting moment where we kind of had to explain to them the communication moves so quickly in esports versus traditional sports and traditional world. Feedback is instantaneous. Our tone of voice has to be our voice as individuals. Otherwise, we can't respond quickly enough. Social media is one way in which quick communication happens, right? As traditionally would have gone back 20 years, it would have been all about the press release, and now social media allows us to respond a lot quicker. Within esports, we also have instant feedback forums like Discord. Discord is absolutely massive in the gaming and esports world. If we get asked a question in Discord, we have to answer straight away. If we need comments or feedback and we use Discord, we can get that feedback straight away. And it almost functions like a public forum meeting that's going on 24/7, which is really awkward when you're working at the weekend or you're out with your family and people have the ability to just message you. It's like having them all added to Facebook Messenger, the entire community. But it's great because it means that I can literally be putting together a presentation for a meeting and need some stats and data and some feedback from the community to make sure that the pitch is right, and I can get it like that. So esports, the communication channels you use to kind of work with the community are fantastic. They cause you a lot of stress and mess with your work-life balance a bit, but actually that instant feedback is brilliant.
And to round off this panel before we might have some questions quickly, where do you see kind of community heading in the future? Is it still on these social platforms? Do you see at the moment behaviours changing, cross-pollination of potentially a community shifting from one game to another at your LANs, or moving in from mobile games into picking up potentially RuneScape? I don't know how everyone feels about that and where they see that shaping. Maybe John, you can kick it off.
Yeah, I guess from our point of view, we're seeing people being a little less defensive from a business point of view these days. So we're seeing more communities from different events being willing to attend others. People are starting to look up to us now because the size we've grown to for advice, which never happened in the past. Everyone was quite closed off. So yeah, certainly from a LAN attendee point of view, we are seeing more and more crossover. Game crossover, less so. The biggest cross we perhaps see at our events that surprises people is everyone assumes that our events are very divided. There's an esports side, there's a casual side. But then when we see the esports guys hopping into pub quizzes, drinking games, that sort of thing, there's a bit of a shock there, but we are very much sort of that community feel. So yeah, we're seeing a crossover. That said, our events have still got the same sort of feel they did 4 or 5 years ago. So yeah, we'll see where it develops, but same for us.
So I suppose 5-10 years ago, games would have been single-shot products. We make a game, it's finished, release it, sell it, great. Maybe do that every year or two. That'd be fantastic. These days, game development is very much moving towards a kind of game-as-a-service model, so that you release a game, it stays live for, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years, something like that. You're constantly bringing new content out for it, engaging the players that way. And just keeping them entertained, and esports and kind of the competitive side of things is a really good tool for that. So in terms of so that's the goal, is to try and bring players on board and keep them entertained for a long time. In terms of cross-pollination, because we're gathering these huge communities around a single game, we're then looking at kind of pivoting and bringing them out into slightly different branches, slightly different genres, and trying to incentivize that with content that you get for free. If you go from one game and try out another one, you get this item or something like that. And we're very much looking to push that kind of cross-pollination across titles. And I think more specifically in relation to esports, for the longest time, back in the early days, there was a lot of animosity between the different tournament organizations and the people who were running esports events. And that generated a lot of animosity amongst the players and their fans of each of the events. But over time, and in the last 2-3 years, I think a lot of the organizers have become much more positively disposed towards each other. It's easier for, I suppose, people like yourself to work across different kind of companies and things like that in terms of hosting. And so there's a lot of cross-pollination between those organizations now, which is, I think, trickling down into the player base, and they're more open and interested in looking at different titles and moving on to different types of titles. Maybe from, if they like Counter-Strike, previously Rocket League wouldn't have been consideration for them, but maybe now they'll actually give it a go because lots of people are having fun with it, and the people at the top level of esports aren't so kind of granular and focused on their specific area, which is just the trickle down from that has been actually really interesting to see from a development point of view, and pretty important for us.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because if I were to work a League of Legends event, I'm sure that I will have a lot less fans in Dota 2 after that, because that's still one of the games that I think a lot of the people in the community would shun me for. But overall, cross-pollination, I mean, it's like I watch football, someone else will watch tennis, and us, discussing which is the better sport to watch. There's people that can love both games to watch. You just don't, you can love all sports. There's so many people that follow so many different sports. It's not like they have to pick one to stick with it, or they don't have to argue that their sport is the best sport, or the most physical, intense, or the most difficult. I think it is more accepted. It started out as a very competitive thing, as mentioned, and I think more people are letting that go and are accepting the fact that, hey, esports as a whole is so broad that there is space for everything, and we're not fighting around the same pie of attention from all the people. Even if, in terms of events, though, sure, at LANs you'll have different games represented, but in big events like the one we're seeing here, I was once at an event that was Counter-Strike and Dota 2 combined. And that was a little bit tricky because there was some crossover with the fans that came and watched. But because it was Dota first, then Counter-Strike, then Dota, then Counter-Strike, the arena was basically rotating people in and out. And that's very tricky to do. I mean, if you're going to a football event, there won't be tennis in the break, That is not something that is done, and I don't think that will grow to that as well. The community, in terms of the future, I will just get bigger. I think that is it. We'll see where it goes from here. I think it's going to be more streamlined, maybe eventually. Obviously, the bigger it gets, the more money gets involved, the more serious people will become. And I think the most important thing, and I think that everybody knows that is involved with esports, is that we like to stick to our roots. It is still a gaming community. Your audience is not 40. Well, maybe by that time it is. I don't know. But your audience is still, the people playing the games, and it's not rocket science. So it's gotta remain fun as well. And I think the future for esports and future for the community is a good one. It's a promising one.
We built esports top down. So online streaming, the online nature and not needing a physical venue meant that we built the World Championship before we built the local league, which is fantastic because it allowed us to rapidly accelerate the growth of esports beyond anything that could be achieved for traditional sports. We were able to bring the entire global audience together in one place and then attract sponsorship against that audience rather than having to try and prove esports worked in each local market and attract a television broadcaster and with a high sort of cost of entry associated. So we built it top down. What that's created, though, is a challenge for participation. We spent a lot of time a couple of years ago looking at what motivates players to compete in tournaments, what puts them off. We found that there was a vast audience that wanted to compete in esports tournaments, about 50% of the gaming market. And when we looked at how many of them were actually actively competing in tournaments, it was a fraction of that total audience. We're trying to understand why is there a difference here? What is the gap between the two groups? And we found that it was primarily for two reasons. One was accessibility, and one was that people didn't think that they were good enough. So people didn't know where to go, and people actually didn't think their skill was high enough. And that was largely because esports, being a global thing, meant that when they went online, they were competing with 240 million other people to be the best. They weren't competing on a local level. If you want to be a professional footballer, you conquer your school first, and then you conquer, a secondary school, and then there might be a local academy. You go up like that, and you get to the top. You can't do that in esports. Well, you can now, And that's kind of the trend that I'm predicting. I think we'll see more development coming further down to cement that route, but it's challenging. I think the trend over the next 5 years is we'll see more support and more growth in regional and kind of local propositions as things filter down from the top, and that will benefit us all with higher participation and ultimately drive more engaged fans that will watch more big tournaments as well.
And just finally, for you to close on what you think Jagex thinks on the future of community for you and your involvement at the game.
Yeah, as far as cross-pollination goes, especially one of the big things that we're about to run into is launching mobile. So launching mobile is going to appeal to millions more players, and what we've got, as I was explaining, is this very nostalgic core community that absolutely love what they have right now, and they're very worried that these millions of new players coming in through mobile who haven't been associated with the game for over a decade will request simpler changes. So a lot of their achievements in the game that they very highly regard and are very proud of, they don't want those to be made easier for the new players who come in who want things to be done easy. They want the quick, click and shoot and, give me the money and that's it. Whereas the guys in our game have invested hundreds and hundreds of hours, years even, for their achievements. So what we've got to do is work with our communities, the new one that's going to be coming in through mobile and our existing one, and make sure that they get along. That's going to be a very tough job, but that's going to be our challenge over the next year or so. And then as far as Deadman goes and competitive events for us, what we have is, as just kind of mentioning, our core community is very efficiency-based. They love to be doing the most efficient methods of money-making or skill training or boss killing or anything like that. If it isn't the most efficient, if it's not the meta, they don't want to do it. So with Deadman and what we offer through competitive gaming, being not the most efficient way to make any money in the normal game or skilling or anything like that, it needs to be incredibly appealing. That's a question that we're still tackling. Does that mean that we need to start offering more money for tournaments so it's more appealing to them, or do we need to start making the tournament more fun in general to say you should sacrifice your efficiency for the sake of having more fun every once in a while? So those are the kind of balances that we have to kind of juggle right now. But yeah, mobile is going to be the biggest one for sure.
Great. Well, thank you very much to everyone that's joined the panel, and thank you for listening about community. As you can see, it's quite key on any influence on a business making it through gaming and esports, and hopefully we've given you a quick insight. Obviously, we'll be around, so if you've got any questions for the panellists, do grab them and ask them, as we decided the conversation was too good to stop for Q&A right now. But I'll pass over to Caroline, and just a round of applause for the panel that joined us, please.